have to wait for the... Excellent. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here with all of you. There's a distinction in moral philosophy between the idea of injustice and the idea of misfortune. A misfortune is something that happens through the fault of no one, an accident, a serendipitous catastrophe, the way of the world, a calamity that causes destruction and human suffering. But when does misfortune become injustice? What if the calamity, for example, disproportionately harms those who are poor and living in precarious zones, because those with wealth have capacity to live in better fortified housing and have access to food, water, education, medical care, mental health care, and so on? And what if these already vulnerable victims of harm have little capacity to rebuild or relocate? I'm referring to the adaptation gap between rich and poor. Moreover, let's imagine that there is a humanitarian response to the calamity, but that it arrives more slowly or sporadically in the precarious zones than in the less precarious ones. We might call this the humanitarian response gap, a theme very much on people's minds in the US right now, following the hurricanes that tore through the Caribbean and southeastern portions of the United States. Let's imagine further that the harm caused by the calamity is in fact not unpredictable or serendipitous at all, but that it is instead the result of human decision or neglect, a poorly or inadequately designed levee that breaks, for example, or crumbling infrastructure that finally fails, or urban zoning practices that capitulate to developers and ignore the risk of placing human settlements in precarious zones. We might call this the planning gap. And let's imagine, finally, that the calamity is an acute, long-term environmental impact of the behaviors and habits of a wealthy minority that make this type of calamity more frequent and the harms it inflicts on the poor more severe. We might call this a responsibility gap. Drawing a line between injustice and misfortune must be understood as a political act. The question where to draw the line and how to apportion responsibility is the question. Now, it's not uncommon in environmental politics that those who cause harm will try to characterize the harm as misfortune with arguments like, calamities like this have always happened. They have nothing to do with my actions. They are the way of the world, an act of nature, an act of God, or else they pass the buck altogether. And as power goes, those who cause environmental harm typically have more capacity and political agility than the victims of harm, who are often already vulnerable and marginalized from a society's circle of moral concern. But let us be clear. The impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable are not a misfortune, they are an injustice. The idea of climate justice embodies all the disparities and gaps that I mentioned earlier and many more. Climate justice is about an adaptation gap between rich and poor. It is about a humanitarian response gap between rich and poor. It is about a planning gap, about a transparency gap, about an education gap, about a health access gap, about a development and energy access gap, and most fundamentally, climate justice is about a responsibility gap. Climate change is caused disproportionately by the production and consumption habits of the world's richest populations. The richest 1 billion people on the planet, here in red, are responsible for about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions, while the poorest 3 billion, without access to affordable fossil fuels, are responsible for about 5%. In contrast, the bottom 3 billion suffer the greatest harms associated with climate change. Climate change is predicted to cause widespread and serious harm to human settlements on the planet, threatening to unravel many of the development gains of the last century, UNICEF. The health impacts of climate change, particularly on the poor, are predicted to become catastrophic by mid-century if significant greenhouse gas reductions do not occur. Climate justice demands that those who cause harm, and especially those who benefit from that harm, bear primary responsibility for remediating it and for preventing further harm in the future. In other words, climate justice has a temporal dimension that is both backward and forward-looking. The wealthy, polluting population has an ethical responsibility both to remediate human suffering in the present caused by past acts and emissions, redistributing aid to populations struggling to adapt. The polluting population also has an ethical responsibility to mitigate future harm by doing everything that we now know is necessary to mobilize a low-carbon global economy, including helping developing economies leapfrog a carbon-based economy like ours and unsustainable urban development practices, as we heard in a moment, and tempering the promotion of our wasteful lifestyle, our structures of sin, as Jeff Sachs put it, as the epitome of human happiness. It could be said that climate justice redistributes responsibility for the common good. There's been no greater or more compelling advocate in our generation for climate justice than His Holiness Pope Francis. He's become our great ally in the integral fight against poverty, the fight for tolerance and human dignity, and the fight against climate change. After the release of Laudato Si', he called for urgent coordinated action. And for those of us who work at the urban scale, it is not surprising that he began by convening mayors. Across the world, there has been deeper commitment to coordinated climate action and social justice together at the municipal level than at the national level, with agile, environmentally progressive mayors who know how to mobilize inventive cross-sector collaborations to get things done. As my colleague and friend Ben Barber, the late political theorist and founder of the Global Parliament of Mayors, put it, cities are the coolest political institutions on earth. I humbly suspect that there was something distinctively Latin American as well about why His Holiness began with mayors. Latin American cities in recent decades have been particularly successful at transforming attitudes and behaviors around climate change and environmental health while producing more equitable outcomes in the city. Many Latin American cities have become almost mythical as living laboratories of equitable green urbanization committed to advancing social justice and climate justice together. For all these experiments, it was about mobilizing the bottom-up, about committing bottom-up energies as a central act of municipal governance. No place better to begin than with Antanas Mockus, the philosopher who became mayor of Bogota, Colombia, in its most intense period of violence in the late 90s and early 2000s. It was a scene of complete chaos and urban breakdown, unemployment, poverty, choking air quality, the worst anywhere on the continent. People referred to Bogota at the time as the most dangerous city on the planet. Mockus declared that urban transformation does not begin with law and order, the conventional political response to chaos. Not with new infrastructure either, that would come later, but with civic strategies designed to transform social behavior, to change hearts and minds. Here's the bulletproof vest that Mockus wore as a performative gesture to expose his own heart. Mockus saw the city as a classroom and became legendary for the distinctive ways that he intervened into the behavioral dysfunction of urban Bogota, using arts and culture in sometimes outrageous performative gestures to dramatically reduce lawlessness and violence, to reconnect citizens with their government and with each other, to increase tax collection, reduce water consumption. He did these very performative public gestures, and ultimately improve quality of life for the poor, dumping drinking water down a toilet to illustrate how much is lost with each flush, and so on. Shifting social norms and renewing public trust ultimately paved the way for Mayor Enrique Peñalosa's renowned multimodal transport network of BRT, bicycle hubs, ciclovia, and dedicated walking paths that literally stitched that troubled city together and revolutionized public transport across Latin America. In other words, shifting norms came first. The environmental interventions followed afterwards. And you can see that here in Peñalosa's claim how central norms shift was in his egalitarian transportation agenda. A developed country, he says, is not a place where the poor have cars. It's where the rich ride public transportation, shifting norms. Mocus and Peñalosa emerged from a long tradition of participatory urbanization across Latin America, stewarded by climate-forward mayors who were inspired by, for example, the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire and his critical pedagogy for reclaiming the humanity of the disempowered. These mayors committed to robust agendas of civic participation to ignite a sense of collective agency and dignity among the poor, and ultimately to produce greener and more equitable cities. From the Workers' Party mayors in Porto Alegre, Brazil, who experimented with participatory budgeting in the 1970s, to Jaime Lerner, who pioneered bus rapid transit and dozens of green interventions across Curitiba, Brazil in the 1980s, to the social urbanism of Medellin, Colombia in the early 2000s that transformed public spaces and green infrastructure into sites of education and citizenship building, transforming Medellin into a global model of urban social justice. Not that it doesn't still have its challenges. This tradition still thrives in cities across the continent, from La Paz to Quito to Mexico City, and carries important lessons for equitable green urbanization in cities across the world today. But we're not all Latin Americans. And in the second part of my talk, I'd like to shift to the idea of climate justice as a subject of public communication. I want to think about audience and open a provocative question about how useful climate justice is to us right now as a language to publicly communicate the urgency of climate change, and suggest that perhaps in light of our discussions at this summit, perhaps public health is a much better language, a more effective lever to instigate broad social change. I know this may not be the most inspiring way to begin our section on the poor and the vulnerable, especially after Jeff Sachs' powerful call to action this morning. But I think we need to be extremely agile when communicating with resistant publics and policymakers, and consider alternative pathways to achieving our ends. In the Bending the Curve report of 2015 that Ram introduced, we devoted a full chapter to the urgent public health impacts of climate change, a chapter I co-authored called Bending the Curve and Closing the Gap, Climate Change and Public Health. But we didn't think at the time to include public health as part of the solution, as a lever for changing social attitudes and behaviors about global warming. We only thought about it as an impact. And so I'd like to think further about that. As a moral philosopher trained in the social sciences, I've come to appreciate the importance of realism when mobilizing theory into practice. In other words, how to get from what we know to what we do. Here in this room, we don't need to be convinced about the hardships of poverty or that climate change complicates and deepens them. Here we are already committed on ethical grounds to remediating disproportionate impacts. But when we're out there engaging publics that disagree passively or surreptitiously, we must become realists. Our ethics must become more practical, more strategic. We must be willing to travel alternative paths, paths that are ethically incomplete and partial and incremental and sometimes circuitous. When the harms we seek to remediate are severe and urgent, when tipping points are in sight, ideals can be a hindrance. As Amartya Sen, the developmental economist, says, we need to welcome what he calls partial realizations in times of urgency, since ethical compromises can often get better results. This is very useful advice for us when thinking about how to speak to audiences who are not motivated by social justice or collective ends, who don't share our distributional priorities, and who, through habit or agenda, are inured to the status quo. For these audiences, I believe we must find the right lever to turn them as they are toward the ends that we seek. We can ethically motivate changes at the margins when opportunity costs are low enough, but a fundamental change requires a shift in how we communicate. We know, for example, that people become more receptive to climate-friendly public policy when they better understand the specific impacts of climate change on their own lives and their own communities. A study by the Union of Concerned Scientists of attitudes and behaviors among residents of low-lying coastal communities in South Florida found that climate-friendly attitudes and behaviors are likelier when the negative effects of climate change are made concrete and relevant, rather than something far off like melting ice caps and polar bears. Researchers found that when people understand precisely how sea level rise will affect their own city, their attitudes change. This was true even for a majority of individuals self-described as conservative. Second, and very instructively for us, the same study found that people are likelier to change their behavior, not only their beliefs, but their behavior, when concrete opportunities for climate action at the local scale are made available to them. As Maria said yesterday in her fantastic talk, knowing the risks without having opportunity to act can lead to paralysis. So the conclusion from this opinion research, this public opinion research is, go local, start with impact, making impact clear, and end with action. Given this, I believe we will be more effective if we reframe our current message, those of us working on climate justice, from a language of duty to a language of prudence, from a language of climate justice, which motivates only those who are already religiously, ethically, or publicly inclined to change their behavior for the benefit of others who are least well off, to change our language from justice to a language of personal health and well-being, from a language of the other and a language to a language of the self. As a moral philosopher, it brings me pain to say it, but as a social scientist, I've resolved that urgency demands it. Climate justice is a language of disproportionate impact and blame, and it's not the best vehicle for instigating broad social change. Those who are already immune to the urgencies of human suffering across the globe, who are deaf to the idea of global justice sui generis, will not be motivated by the addition of a threat multiplier like climate change. In fact, as I noted at the start of my talk, the language of climate change can actually trigger a defensive retrenchment in some audiences, an ethical backpedaling into the mindset of misfortune. I believe that the modern idea of enlightened self-interest, explored by the economist Albert Hirschman, can be very helpful here. It was used as an idea in history as a proxy for altruism. It helped explain why individuals who are not motivated by social or altruistic ends nevertheless can produce social benefits. And it happens through prudence, that you recognize a convergence of your own interest with the urgence of others, so that in a selfish world, public and private ends can still converge. Obviously, the idea of self-interest is not new in the climate change discussion. We've been talking about carrots and sticks for a long time. Obviously, I just have another minute or two. This is one of California's sometimes controversial success, using the carrot of cap and trade. But along these lines of thinking about carrots, why not also think creatively about risk aversion, another powerful motivator, and especially the personal health risks of climate change? As Maria said again powerfully yesterday, let's not frame this as an environmental crisis, but as a public health crisis. And 4 very quick preliminary thoughts about this. We need to change norms. We have to equate mitigating climate change with preserving health and well-being, so that these 2 things are indistinguishable from one another. We need a massive global exposomics, as it was referred to this morning, to change norms. Second, relatedly, we need to equalize impacts to stimulate a more generalized sense of public urgency. So focusing on stroke and cardiovascular disease and respiratory disease and so forth, on air pollution. These are very powerful equalizing tools. The idea that we are all in this together, regardless of our wealth and social position, expanding the likely circle of victimhood is a very important lever for social change. Again, those of us fighting for climate justice, we need to accommodate this. Urgency demands compromise, so we need to be strategic. Third, we need to think about who is best situated to communicate public health risks, and the issue of trust is essential here. In our brave new fact-free world, politicians, journalists, scientists, intellectuals have all been castigated as untrustworthy, but doctors have not yet suffered the same fate to the same extent. So we need to mobilize the health profession. From this perspective, these climate activists are already half right. Move people from what they love. Unfortunately, it's not going to be Mother Earth, and it's not going to be common humanity. It's going to be their own well-being. And to accomplish this, doctors need to get on board. So in this sense, it may well be that the GP, the pediatrician, the obstetrician gynecologist, the midwife, and the nurse practitioner are our most important soldiers on the ground right now in the privacy of their examination rooms. This entails, finally, a 4th important shift, something most of you in this room know more about than me, but we need to rethink how we educate our health practitioners. Health education needs to become increasingly integral and so forth, and I'm very proud to be on the advisory board of UC San Diego's new Institute for Public Health, which is committed to doing all of these things. On this note about transforming university education, I'd like to end by describing very briefly a community-engaged environmental health initiative at the University of California, San Diego, called the UC San Diego Community Stations that I lead with my colleague, urbanist Teddy Cruz, who's here with me. The community stations are a network of research and teaching stations located in disadvantaged neighborhoods located around the university, in our case, along the US-Mexico border, which is just a few miles from where our university sits. These are stations where the knowledge of the community and the knowledge of the university can combine. And we've committed these stations to 3 ends: community-based environmental health education for our students on the campus, increasing environmental health literacy among youth and adults in our partner communities, so, environmental health on the ground education, and finally, learning a lot from Latin America, participatory climate action at local scale. This is the neighborhood. This is what it looks like on the ground. This is the Earth Lab. It's located in a neighborhood called Encanto. It's San Diego's most challenged inner-city neighborhood, disrupted by freeway infrastructure, utility easements, and situated along the city's most polluted waterway. Earth Lab is a 4-acre open-air outdoor environmental classroom with community gardens, solar houses, water harvesting facilities, a nanogrid, and other green infrastructure designed by UC San Diego researchers. It's an outdoor living laboratory. This is how you change social norms with children from the ground up at the bottom, and this is very highly scalable activity. Thank you.